I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World.
Yeah.
More.
Hello and welcome. I accidentally started the podcast, so now we're going. Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. This is the 9th episode of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, but it's going to be around, I'm not sure what the order is going to be. So this is either 155 or 156 of the podcast, but it's the 9th episode of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, celebrating the stories that appear in this here book, edited by Robert Silverberg, but chosen by the members of the Science Fiction Writers of America in 1970. These, we've done this 8 times now, y'all. So you should know what we're up to. But my guest for this story, which we are covering, The Huddling Place by Clifford Simak, who we have covered on this podcast before. We did Rule 18 with Alec Neville Ali and Seth Heasley during our series on 1930s science fiction. But this story is from the 40s, and it's The Huddling Place, which eventually became chapter 2 of Clifford Simak's masterwork, City. So we'll be talking about all that. But I have 2 great guests to talk about this story. One is a returning guest, Joachim Boaz, otherwise known to folks as the editor behind and the writer behind the Sci-Fi Ruminations blog. If you're not reading this blog, you should be reading this blog. It's great. It's one of my favorites. Joachim came on to talk about his methodology and everything that he does in a prior episode. I don't remember which number, but it's here on Postcards. And he's also a Hoosier, so he lives in Indiana, my home state, so I also appreciate that. But also joining us is Greg Mollin, who is the owner and operator of one of my favorite bookstores in San Diego County. Up north in Encinitas is Artifact Books. I'm sure a couple times you've seen me wear the shirt on this podcast for Artifact Books. My number one main bookmark is right now in You Like It Darker, Stephen King, is my Artifact Books Read Hard bookmark, which sticks out of my books now all the time. Greg, welcome to the podcast for the first time. Joachim, why don't you start us off by telling us how you got involved with science fiction, a thumbnail version of how you ended up here.
So in my late teens, I was a fantasy reader, and then I was at my grandfather's house and I found my dad's bookshelf. And so it's the science fiction fascinating sort of science fiction with me. And at the time, I didn't entirely know what to make of it. And then I happened to be at my local bookstore, and they had like the Hugo Award list next to the science fiction section. And I just started reading from the beginning and just found every single one whenever I went there. And so I read every Hugo winner. And then what has happened is I now, because my father sort of stopped reading science fiction in his mid-teens, I now sort of share science fiction with him. And this became sort of an all-consuming passion later in my life. And so while I was in graduate school, it became sort of this online sort of fascinating world in which I could write outside of the sort of strictures of training to be an academic. And so science fiction became sort of a liberating thing to write about. More recently, I've come to Simak because I'm fascinated in 40s and 50s sort of visions of post-capitalist futures, and in particular the sort of rights of workers. And so I have returned very, very, very recently to his work with a renewed passion, because I read City as an older teen. That was the last time.
Yeah, and you reached out to me wanting to be on this episode, which is funny because I had you for other episodes in this series later, but as soon as you and I started talking about Simak, I was like, okay, that makes perfect sense. And so I'm really glad you're here. Greg, tell the folks, more about how you got interested in genre as a reader and ended up starting a bookstore.
Yeah, well, I kind of came to science fiction in the same way that Joachim did. I started reading fantasy first. Fantasy was I had a bigger interest in, but every time I went to the bookstore or I went to my local library, I kept running into science fiction writers that were kind of crossing over, and I'm noticing similarities not only in maybe cover art, because Frazetta started doing some really cool, science fiction covers. Um, but my parents had a great library. I got to read whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. So I just kind of started jumping, genre jumping whenever I felt like it. And I was like, it kind of blew me away because fantasy had this particular kind of structure and style, and I noticed that science fiction seemed to be a lot more open as far as like ideas. They weren't putting themselves in a particular world. It seemed to me like fantasy had to go by these particular boundaries, and I thought that when I started reading science fiction as a fan, it really opened up. There's a lot more there that seemed to me to be said almost closer. I mean, I hate to say it's like closer to something like literary fiction, but I mean they were using the same, I think, dynamics in science fiction. At least some of the writers were. And Clifford Simak, the first moment that I started reading his stuff, I thought he was incredible. Like you could take the genre stuff out of most of his stories, and he would just be a really fine writer. So I've always pushed him at the store because there are a lot of folks that know a lot of the bigger names, or at least the more contemporary names. Everybody knows Asimov and but I like the idea of being able to push those stories because I loved them so much, and I think my enthusiasm for them is helpful in selling them and getting them in front of new eyes.
Well, and let me tell a funny story about going into your bookstore. Artifact Books in Encinitas, California, which is one of three of the best places to get like old school science fiction in San Diego, greater San Diego County. And the first time I went in there, I walked in and I went to your science fiction section and I was looking around and I was like, man, I am not into this store. All this stuff is modern. This is all modern science fiction. Like, this is really boring. This is nothing I want to see. And then I turned around and you have this cabinet of all your vintage books, right? And then I started looking through it. I was like, God, this store rules because you separated all the vintage stuff from the modern stuff in a way that actually ended up making it so much easier because then I don't have to look at all the modern shit. I can look at the old school stuff. And then I was like just losing my mind and a lot of money because I ended up spending a ton of money that day. Because you also know how to price the stuff. You know what you've got, which a lot of places, like if you find stuff at Goodwill or whatever, they don't know what they got. Right. But you do know what you've got. So but I did I remember having a much heavier bag of books to take the train back to downtown San Diego from. But yeah, Artifact Books is great. So
Thanks.
yeah, and also on our book tour with John Shirley, we had a fantastic event. Cody Goodfellow and myself and John Shirley for the book release of Suborbital 7, Vertical, and my book, The Last Night to Kill Nazis, is one of the best book events I've ever done. was that event at Artifact Books. So shout out.
Hey, and by the way, all of those books are still available, signed copies still available on the website. So if anybody's interested in those things, and Last Night to Kill Nazis, I'm still selling and I'm hand selling that book. I mean, it does it itself.
Yeah.
Anytime someone comes in and sees a book that says something about killing Nazis, they're like, yes, I need a copy of this one.
Right. Right.
But
I
yeah,
appreciate that.
the 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 setup with the vintage sci-fi in the back, I did it kind of like a comic book store because I used to love going into comic book stores and digging through the vintage comics. And so I basically just used that same system for vintage paperbacks, and people like you find it, and it's like, oh my God, here's where the gold is.
Right, right. And yeah, and it's funny because that it worked exactly right. And shout out to our mutual friend Dano Mahoney, who was the one who was like, dude, you got to go to Greg's store. He's like, you'll go nuts. And so that first time I went into Artifact was really being pushed by Dano. Okay, so let's get into I gotta pull up my notes for this story. And but let's go around and give everybody's origin story with Clifford Simak. With Joachim, how did you first read Clifford Simak?
So the first one I read was City, which of course revises these earlier published short stories. And then I read things like Way Station and the big hitters. And only much later, sort of in the last 2 years or so, I returned to his fiction. And I send a lot of short stories to Olav at the Hugo Book Club website on his list on sort of organized labor. And I kept on finding Clifford D. Simak stories which sort of reference future manifestations of unions or dystopic manifestations of unions, or sort of organizations of spacers who try to fight against the horrors of space travel or whatever it might be. And so I kept on sending him these stories. And finally, I was like, you know what? I actually need to read these stories and reread them and reread them. In between, though, I had randomly just picked up a few Simak novels. But I think of sort of back before I started my site, I read pretty religiously his work. I don't think that I really rated it as highly as I do now. It's been sort of a breath of fresh air, sort of returning to him, because I'm very much in Silverberg's camp. I think he sort of wrote that behind Simak's his phrases and his sort of pastoral settings, there is great sort of conceptual complexity, and it's easy to miss. And I really, really respect that. Like when a story can slip you into these ways to think about the world. And so I really find that fascinating with Simak. And so that's how I've gotten to this point. And I plan on rereading and rereading.
Yeah. And it should be no surprise that a Minnesotan would have such a strong feeling for unions. Considering that the Democratic Party there is the DFL, the Democratic Farm and Labor, and I'm saying this, my father was a big DFL guy, grew up in Minnesota, and but I know how important labor is to Minnesota. It's one of the and he's a newspaper man from Minnesota, but we'll get into his history in a minute. Greg, how did you first discover Simak?
It would have been through the pulps, through the astounding stuff like that, because I was always collecting. I started collecting weird tales when I was young, and then again, like I said, once I started getting into the science fiction stuff, I kept seeing his name over and over again. I might have picked it up because there was a more familiar name to me. And then I started reading those stories. And then, of course, that led me to City, which I thought the concept was so kind of crazy but it was also, brilliant. And so it was truly from those old issues of Astounding, because he was I think he might have debuted, I don't know, a few stories, at least if I recall correctly, debuted some of his bigger stories in some of those. So I would just start again, once I see someone's name enough and I start to read it and I really get with the vibe of it, that was how I became a fan. And then reading The City, like I said, that was a big one for me.
Yeah, I think he had a couple stories pre-Campbell, before Campbell took over.
Yeah.
But and I know we would have had that information on our Rule 18 episode, but so I discovered Simak from a recommendation from a very specific person, my homie Matt Whitaker, the longtime bass player of the Belgian Waffles, a noise punk rock band that was infamous in Indiana. And he worked in a record store in my hometown, Karma Records. And I used to walk in there to mostly get music recommendations from Matt, but Matt was also a science fiction guy. And we were talking about Asimov one day, and he said, well, you like Asimov. I like Simak better. You should read Simak. And then my lifelong love of Simak started with Matt Whitaker suggesting him to me, and I believe I read Cemetery World first, was just the one that I found first. But to bring this full circle, when we covered Way Station on the Dickheads podcast, I had Matt on to be my guest talking about Way Station. So you can check that out on the Dickheads podcast, my other podcast. So and a lot of my history of Simak are just cribs from my notes for that episode. But yeah, so let's get into the history of Clifford Simak before we start getting into the story. Simak was born August 3rd, 1904. So we just missed his birthday 10 days ago. He won the Hugo Award 3 times, won 1 Nebula. And the Science Fiction Writers of America named him the 3rd of the Grandmasters. He was the 3rd person to be named a Grandmaster. And the Horror Writers Association also gave him the 1st Bram Stoker Award for Lifetime Achievement. He was the 1st Lifetime Achievement winner from the Bram Stoker Awards, which is interesting. The International Fantasy Award for Best Fiction went to City in 1953. Just a couple of years, but I think that was the first year they gave the Hugos, was 1953. But he was born in Wisconsin. He was the son of John Lewis and Margaret Simak. He attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Now, an interesting thing about Simak is he grew up in rural Wisconsin, and one of the things that I learned about him was that he's old school enough that he went to school on a horse. Before there was even there weren't even a lot of cars in his elementary school in his county at the time when he was going to elementary school. So he saw like the birth of car culture and all that. He worked at various newspapers around the Midwest. He was a newspaper man, but the majority of his career from 1939 on, he was working at the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and he was there until he retired. And he also ran the Tribune's science reading series over the years. And, he kind of had this, as a newspaper man in Minnesota, I think, and Joaquin, when we get into talking about his labor things, that's why I think his connection to, if not being part of the DFL, but covering the DFL and covering labor around Minnesota would have been so formative. And his first story was The World of the Red Sun, which was published by Hugo Gernsback in the 1931 issue of Wonder Stories. So yeah, he sold to Gernsback first, and so he was active before. Now, he was a regular of Campbell's stable, but he was, unlike Asimov and some of the other guys that could just wander into his office, and be handed like, oh, you're going to be the author of Foundation now because I just gave you this idea. Simak couldn't do that because he lived far away, so he didn't have quite that connection to Campbell. But he also did not do a lot of conventions in the early years and was busy doing a family and doing the newspaper in Minneapolis. And he did less of that stuff until right around the 60s when more of his career was taken up by writing the books. But he published regularly from 1931 to 1981, which is a long run, and then he died in 1988. In my personal opinion, I have a whole stack over here of Clifford Simak books. Big fan of Time and Again, Ring Around the Sun, Cemetery World, a whole bunch of different ones. But to me, City is his masterpiece from the 50s. And I was so excited to talk about this story because it's an excuse to talk about City. I would like to cover City as a whole eventually on this podcast, but for the time being, as a part of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, this story on its own, which would become part of a fix-up, was voted by the science fiction writers to be a part of the Hall of Fame, which the last story that I recorded, not the last episode, but the Weapon Shop was also a Von Vogt expanded into a novel, and this was a common practice. And it's interesting because I'm about to write a review for a modern novel. David James Keaton, Shallow Ends, he just did a fix-up novel, and he took a bunch of his short stories and tied them together with a plot. And I told him, like, dude, as a modern author, you're doing a thing that the writers in the 40s and 50s did all the fucking time. And I thought it was really cool that he did that. But, this was common then. It is not common now. But, and you have to think about the difference in the marketplace was that you pretty much had to prove that a story was going to sell wider by serializing it in the magazines. But also that was just the guaranteed way you were going to make money off the story. That being said, this story was sold in the magazine as the sequel to City, to the short story which makes up the first chapter of the novel. And so this story was considered a sequel at the time. I don't know if Simak envisioned it as a overarching novel at this time or if that came later. It's really hard to find any evidence on that. Joaquin, did you find any evidence on that?
I do not know.
Yeah. I don't think that there is any. I looked really hard the other day, and in fact, one of the things I found was your blog with the 6 interviews, and I went very intensely through that. But no, I haven't seen anything that really says that he intended it to. But I don't know how everybody else feels, but I've always felt like it felt like a coherent novel. I didn't know about its fix-up nature the first time I read it. Right?
I would point out that there were very few novels published in the 40s. The market hadn't shifted so much to paperback books yet. And so that really, really will pick up in the early 50s. And then retrospectively looking back at this whole series of linked stories, it makes sense why it would appear as a fix-up in the early 50s.
Yeah, in fact, A.E. Von Vogt was the first science fiction writer to get a hardcover, right? To get a novel that, was the first time ever that, and I still think that one was World of Null A, and that still was serialized 4 years earlier in Astounding. So, I could be wrong about that fact, but I'm pretty sure that is the case. But regardless, this story appearing in Astounding, as a sequel, it's funny that this sequel, as it were, was the one that everybody remembers, is the one that really like kind of got to people enough that they voted for it. So any feelings on that first story, or anything you guys think we need to talk about first about that first chapter, starting with Joachim? Is there anything you feel like is really important to note before we start talking about it? Because some people will have just read this story, right? For this, and some people will have read all of it. But what do you think, Joachim? Is there anything?
Yeah, the first story sets a sort of connection to this farther future, which I think is worth discussing. So there are two versions, obviously, in the fix-up and then in the 1944 original publication. And so in the 1944 original publication, Simak puts forward a theory that cheap access to energy and transportation will lead people to increasingly not be tied to cities. And they will head to the countryside, buy large 10-acre plots of land or whatever it might be, and then fly into work on personal airplanes or whatever. I think he says helicopters. And so you have this scenario where people are fleeing the cities. And so Huddling Place takes place in one of those sort of country estates. In the revised version in 1952, and Simak will also return to this a few other times, he puts forward an even, I think at the time, more compelling reason for decentralization of life and industry, and that is fears of nuclear war. So in the 1952 version, cities were targets, and so this gives the extra motivation for people to take advantage of the technology they now have access to and leave the cities. And so that is the sort of added element.
One of Simak's motivations for writing this to begin with is that he fucking hated cities. Like he was not a city guy, and he had to live in Minneapolis for his job, and he did not like it. He did not want to live in a city. He wanted to live in a pastoral place. And he mentioned in a couple interviews that, I mean, he didn't put it as bluntly as I did, but you know, I'm sure was, has said it in a different way. But the point is he did not like cities. But yes, and that difference between the original and that is key. Like the added nuclear threat thing to it kind of gives it more of a reason. But yeah, it is a fascinating part of this. Greg, do you have anything you want to say about the first story?
Well, yeah, and it's basically the same thing. I mean, it's just that early connector to why people have decided to spread out, and like the kind of growing agoraphobia that everybody is having. And I think he mentioned something about like there really was no more war, there really was no more conflict, so people were able to finally go and do this. They didn't need to spend. And is that in the first story? Is that I just don't recall. But
Yeah,
so it kind of sets the stage for what happens in the Huddling Place. I think it's important, but I mean, I think it can also be read, on its own. I don't think it's necessary, but I do like the fact that it sets that stage and kind of gives you the idea, the interim little snippets that go between the chapters, so to speak.
I also in the original version of City, I think it's a good window into some of Simak's political concerns. So scholarship tends to be very, very confused on his political allegiances because this rural nostalgia combined with his frustration with city life. And what we see in the story, City, is he is deeply empathetic to the plight of farmers, the plight of farmers. And so the people who now live in the city are mostly farmers who've been evicted from their lands because they can't pay taxes, because big business, this hydroponics farming, has essentially put them out of work. So where do they go? They go squat in the cities. And connected to what you said about the Farmer Labor Party, he's actually writing this story before the merger of the Democratic Party with Hubert Humphrey, who is the mayor of Minneapolis, and who will become the mayor of Minneapolis, and the Democratic Party. So so one really helpful way to think about Simak is if you look at his 40s stories, they are stridently anti-capitalist. They imagine big business on the loose in the galaxy, destroying everything that they touch. And he is sort of channeling some of that, the anti-capitalist views of the Farmer Labor Party. But then simultaneously, it was like a third-party leftist organization which attempted to reach out beyond the unionized worker to the farmer. And so it like unified two often not politically aligned groups. And so you see that in the original city story. And I think it helps us put some of Simak's nostalgia into historical relief, because it's easy to chalk up nostalgia for the rural life as a sort of a conservative viewpoint versus a real political concern, the independence of farmers.
And I want to get more into how the story stands on its own with if you just read it by itself in a little bit, but I do think maybe we should go through that particular issue of Astounding right now. And I apologize for anyone who can hear my dogs barking, but the neighbor just took her dog out, and so the new stars of the podcast, the new rescue dogs, will make their appearance. And so let's look at that issue of. So this is the cover of the July 1944 issue of Astounding, and the cover story is Raymond F. Jones' Renaissance. I'm going to be reading soon some Raymond F. Jones, but I have not, and I know that Alec Neville Ali, who was on this podcast recently, is a huge fan and has pushed me to cover his work and discover his work, which I don't know. Joachim, you're more read on this era. Is there anything you have to say about Raymond F. Jones?
Yes, if you're the person obsessed with Philip K. Dick, check out The Memory of Mars, 1961. It's essentially We Can Recall You for Wholesale, but it's like proto Philip K. Dick, sort of implanted memories of Mars.
41?
61.
61. Oh, because Phil had already written that by then.
Yeah, so it's like a reconceived version of it, and it's really spectacular.
Interesting.
In a more of a direct thriller sense.
All right, so let's check out some of the ads here, which Alec Neville Ali has made sure that I tell you every time that Campbell hated the ads. He had no say over the ads. Listerine shaving cream. I didn't know they made shaving cream too. They will make shaving a pleasure. Greg would not be buying this because he does not need to shave. Let's see. I'm the only non-bearder here, so I guess. So one thing that I can tell you by looking at this table of contents this time is there's not a lot of stories in here. The serial takes up part 1 of 3 parts. The Raymond F. Jones takes up a huge chunk of this issue. Keep in mind, this is a wartime Astounding, and they had less access to authors because some of the authors were over there fighting or had just come back or whatever. So we do know from we talked about this during the Weapon Shop episode that was something a young Philip K. Dick complained about, that the war affected the stories that he was reading, that a lot of authors were away. And so the only other short stories, we do have a Fritz Lieber story, Thought. And then of course Huddling Place is there on page 1. I think it's 53. It's pretty small. We have a bunch of articles, but there's not a ton of stories in this one. Do either of you have any comments on this table of contents? Anything that you see that I'm maybe not seeing. It's cool. There's a Fritz Lieber one.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The Fritz Lieber is probably helped me to pick that up too, because I had already been reading the Swords and Deviltry and all uh uh Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stuff. So anytime I saw another name that I was familiar with, I probably jumped on it, even though I hadn't read that particular one. But yeah.
Yeah, so this was July of 44. So I'm not sure what was going on in the war at that time, but we're towards the end. So, but you can't separate anything during this era from its place in the timeline of the war. So let's flip ahead to, I'll roll us all the way over to where we're the Huddling Place. We can get a look at what it looked like. Look at the rocket torpedoes. I think we're 153. Maybe it was further. Oops. All right. Maybe I need to go back and look and see what page
it's on page 133.
33.
Yeah.
Okay. So here it is, the sequel to City. And I think oops, sorry. A man can't leave his home. So we got this, small piece of artwork. We can see how it's laid out. And it's the artwork is a little understated compared to some of the other ones that we've seen in this era. I don't think Campbell saw this as a super major story at the time. I mean, it is a sequel to a story that was obviously successful enough that he asked for another one. That being said, they were both published in 44, so that leads me to believe that maybe he wrote them together. It doesn't seem like he had enough time to be like, hey, City was really successful, write me another one. I feel like he was working on these, and that leads me to think that maybe he saw the greater theme of the novel like forming. But again, there's no facts there. That's just me, doing some detective work based on this. I'm not sure if here's another art with that kind of pastoral scene. And I believe that's our Martian, right?
Yep.
Martian guy. With a very enormous head. There's more artwork for like the trip to Mars, I guess. Another ad. So yeah, there's several pieces of artwork for the story. But yeah, that's all I've got for looking at it. Now we can kind of get into the actual story. So what I think is interesting about this story and reading it in 2024, right, is that on its own, and I was trying to put City out of my head, as City is a novel that I've read twice in my life, but I was trying to put it out of my head and just try to think of it on its own. And the funny thing is I'd forgotten when, leading up to this, that it was a part of City until I was a few paragraphs in, and then I went, oh yeah, this is from City. But one of the things I think is cool about how it stands on its own is if you think about how disjointed the internet has made people in this day and age, where people, it's funny to me because Greg, you have a teenager, I believe, right? And so it's weird because when you're, as a teacher, I'm around kids, like kids today, like they're more inclined to send messages to each other online, and they're not hanging out like we used to do, right? And
Oh yeah.
like the very idea of them getting together and doing things, like, it seems weird. They don't want to do it. And like, so that's what this story made me think of, is it had like kind of a message about how technology can lead to agoraphobia. And I was kind of viewing it through this weird 2024 lens of kind of post internet. And which is not an accurate reading, but it's an interesting reading when you think of it as an almost 80-year-old story, right? And how differently we're viewing the story with an 80-year lens from the guy who wrote it. Which is one of the reasons why it's awesome to read old school science fiction, right?
I think it feels, I mean, I think it does speak to some of that pretty well. You know what I mean? Like the fact that he's dialing in and he's able to, and he says something about like that he can transfer not only his, you know, mentality, his mind, but he can, then he puts himself into the situation where he's there. And so like people are doing that all the time. I mean, telecommunicating, I think is what he was doing. He's his dial turning and he's talking to the dude on Mars. And then later on when he's speaking to I forget the title of the basically the guy that contacts him is like, you got to save your Martian friend. We got to, I don't want to jump too far ahead in the story or whatever. I don't know how we're going to,
No, it's
but
fine.
I mean, I think it
we're
seems,
assuming at this point that people have read it.
yeah, I mean, I think it feels very, and the more going back and reading it again, to me at least, made me feel more like it did have some pretty serious relevance for what's going on now, or at least I'm seeing parallels with what's going on.
Yeah, and I tried not to think about the robots and the dogs and the whole setup when I was reading it for this time, but
But was he like the first guy that came up with like Jenkins, like the robot servant? Because I'm trying to think of other stories that there was.
Sure, there were all kinds of
Yeah. It's just seems
robot.
to me to be one of the early ones that I can remember.
Yeah. Joachim, what are your thoughts as first time you reread this
Mhm.
for your article, right? And before even like I invited, before we just decided to do this podcast, right?
Yeah, so I'm always struck by Simak's very interesting interaction with technology. There's one of those interviews which you referenced where he straight out asked, "What are your views on technology? You sound like you absolutely hate technology." And his response is technology that is used to perpetuate sort of current economic status and capitalism. That's his primary like complaint about technology. And so when you see technology in Simak's stories, it often takes this sort of ambivalent route because, as you all both have mentioned, that the sort of virtual reality technology, it seems to be limiting the sort of his Martian friend's ability to use our minds, right? And so often when technology is a crux in Simak's stories, it's a negative thing versus facilitating the correct type of life. And so it's almost that virtual reality section where he can go to any location. That's of course foreshadowing, I imagine, the sort of the sort of later developments in the series of stories. And so I find technology as a crux a perpetually fascinating sort of modern theme.
Right, and I'm pretty sure. I mean, they're he's definitely one of the first people to write about genetically uplifted dogs too, and or like uplifted animals. I mean, I know Walter Miller did it a decade later, but actually in a book I bought at your store, I read Greg, the Conditionally Human. Um, I know in that novella he wrote about uplifted pets and that kind of thing, companion animals, but I really think City is one of the first to do that. And I think in relation to Huddling Place, which is really cool, is that it's kind of separate from that whole thing, but it fits into the novel so well because it fits in the novel really well if you know where it's kind of going from the way it sets up in city, but it also stands alone on its own. It's very, very, very cool. But on that note, Joachim, could you tell us a little bit more about like how city fits into what you're the work you're doing with studying science fiction and labor stuff?
So the first story in the sequence,
Either
because
one, just like the whole thing.
yeah, so before the end of World War II, Simak is writing, as I mentioned, a whole series of short stories. The best which come to mind are Tools and Masquerade in the early 40s, where humans are out in the galaxy at Mercury or Venus, and they have some new type of technology, some new like sort of energy needs, and they exploit a planet and accidentally hurt native people. And so when you read City, it is sort of connected to that because he is imagining a brotherhood with aliens. He is imagining a world where there really aren't big businesses, at least in the Huddling Place. In the original, in City, the 1944 short story, there are. They sort of push people off the land. And again, a lot of people tend to think of Simak's nostalgia as a sort of something to pine for, but then simultaneously, what's so incredibly striking about Huddling Place, it's yet another trap humans find themselves in, right? And it's a sort of sinister edge rather than liberation.
Well, and another thing that's interesting about the Huddling Place is it's a slow motion apocalypse, right? Because what we generally think of apocalypse novels or novels that are about post-human survival or post-apocalyptic is that some massive event came and just like wiped everybody out. And what's kind of neat about City is that it takes place, the majority of it is reflecting on how this slow motion like end of the world happened. And unfortunately I kind of feel like we're in that situation right now with like climate change and how like I can't believe that people can't watch, like I'll just use the example of I watch ABC News to get like a national newscast every day usually on YouTube. And the first news story for the last like couple months, if it's not the presidential election, it's horrendous weather, terrible weather somewhere, heat storms, tornadoes, hurricanes. And it seems like they're getting worse like all the time. And the heat waves, all these things. And I'm like, can people not see what's happening? Right? Like it's so obvious. But what's cool about Huddling Place is it's another example of like all these things are happening so quickly or so slowly that you could miss it. And it's the idea that Jenkins and these dogs are like sitting around talking about, oh, remember those humans, right? And it's such a interesting concept for we've had all these kinds of apocalyptic novels, but to have survivors who are not human to be able to look back and kind of do a post-mortem on human civilization, it's as cool of an idea that somebody had for a science fiction story. It's like one of the coolest ideas ever, like, and it's one of the things that I think it's a gee whiz cool thing. And I don't know, I'm like, Greg, did you see this novel that way? Did you see it as a post-apocalyptic novel, or did you just see it as high concept science fiction when you read it?
Well, I guess if I were to think about it more like that, then yeah, it is. I mean, and also knowing the setup now, but I thought it was more like just a rumination on like the misery of what humans can do to themselves without the end of the world. I mean, this guy is the end of the world to this guy is just having to leave his spot and go back out to a huddling place. You know what I mean? That's so I'm reading more of a personal, rather than the overarching idea that it's, post-apocalyptic, but I mean, it definitely has that feel. And I can get with it, but yeah, upon a reread, like I said, to me it seems so much more personal, but we know that in the background, these things, this is all happening, and we're edging toward it. Just like you said, um, an author that I love, William Gibson, his The Peripheral, his latest two novels. There's a big cataclysmic event that happens, or it's a series of cataclysmic events that they call the jackpot, but it's like you were saying, it's the slow death. There's climate change on top of, world poverty and numerous wars and all these things that build up slowly to the fact that we're not aware enough of them. And I think that if anything, that's what this definitely shows is that sort of, like you said, the slow apocalypse that's happening in the background, that we know.
Yeah, and as a
And the
Dickian, I too can't help but think of it because he was an extremely agoraphobic, right? And like I and as somebody he was reading all these pulps at the time, I'm wondering. I did find myself wondering, like, oh, I wonder how Phil felt about the Huddling Place, but and he was a voter in 1970 in Syphilis, so I wonder if he voted for it, but we'll never know. Joaquin, you were about to make a point.
and speaking to that, the incredibly important historical events that are underneath the surface in Huddling Place, so that this moment of missing out on saving your alien friend almost feels like a moment where there could have been a distinct future. So again, in Simak's stories, often humans develop these ESP abilities which free them. And the implication is that his alien friend has discovered a new philosophy which humans could use. And Simak seems to be obsessed with this philosophy that can improve man, that isn't a technology which is a crux. And there's the possibility that his discovery could have changed the eventual trajectory of mankind or humankind. And so it's the personal, it's through the lens of the personal experience and the connection to place and the sadness and all of that, but it connects to this larger sort of moment that humanity's missing.
And by the way, I found this Robert Silverberg quote, and I'm going to read it about Huddling Place. And it does say here that they were 2 months apart, the two stories. So I cannot believe that they were not written at the same time. I feel like they had to have been, or back to back, anyways. So Silverberg said, 2 months later came a sequel, Huddling Place, that carried the premise of its predecessor into new, unsuspectably somber territory, as Simak demonstrated that one of the consequences of dismantling American urban life would be a crushing sense of agoraphobia. Huddling Place, when the ratings came in, finished in second place behind the opening installment of Raymond F. Jones' powerful and popular novel Renaissance. What he's talking about, second place, is that the readers would always vote their favorite stories for issues. So when I don't remember, they sent them in, or like, I don't remember the process, but and when Census, the third segment of what is now obviously going to be a continuing series, appeared in September 1944 issue, it finished a strong second behind another installment of Renaissance. Campbell's readership, in the main, a fastidious and knowledgeable group of sophisticated science fiction readers, had quickly come to see that Simak had something special underway. So yeah, the astounding readers were picking up on it. So I mean, there weren't a ton of stories, so like coming in second, but I mean, came in ahead of Fritz Lieber, right? And even though Fritz Lieber wrote the worst Hugo winning novel of all time, The Wanderer, As much as I respect some of the things he did, The Wanderers is a unmitigated piece of shit. So I can't. Which would have been fine. Every writer can have a piece of shit, but the fact that it won the Hugo just still boggles my mind. So, um, but back to Huddling Place and Silverberg's comments. I think what he's saying is that he thinks that the readers were picking up quickly on what Simak was laying down, and but I think he was already a popular author at this point. He had been publishing since 1931 in science fiction. I'm assuming he had a reputation already. Um, you know, magazine readers, and look, I grew up old enough that I was getting the Twilight Zone magazine all the time, right? And there were certain times where I'm like, ooh, there's a so and so story in this one. I'm definitely getting that one, And so I'm sure that the way it worked is if you're like a teenage Philip K. Dick and you're going to the spinner rack in Berkeley to pick up the latest issue of Astounding, and you see Simak's name on there, you're probably like, oh yeah, that's awesome. I love him. Although for PKD it was Von Vogt was his favorite. But I'm sure there were tons of readers who were like, yay, Simak, like when they got to the drugstore or wherever they bought Astounding and had that reaction. So, and I'm sure people who liked City were excited to get a sequel 2 months later. Like, oh, hell yeah. That being said, are there any other themes that you think I'm missing for Huddling Place before we talk about City as a whole novel? Joachim first.
So I'm always fascinated by depictions of space travel and the sort of nature of exploration. And what is so fantastic about Simak's sort of futures is he is very conflicted about exploration, incredibly sort of conflicted about exploration. And instead, they tend to be all these very internal and personal stories. And or if there is exploration, as I mentioned, it tends to be devastating exploration. And you get that sense here. Not only does he fear space travel or going to Mars, but Mars has become essentially a suburb, of Earth. Like Mars is no longer this wonder-filled place. And this it's not only the sort of details of his own sort of rural existence, it's also how the extent of humanity is never a real focus of the story, yet they're out there, they're in the galaxy. And I really, really find that appealing.
Mm-hmm. Greg, do you have anything else about the themes of the story?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I'd have to agree with what Joaquin was saying. I mean, I like the idea of the impact that we're having further out there. It's not just about the travel. He mentioned something about some sort of a plague or something. The first few years he's on Mars and he helps them through the plague because he's the one doctor that knows their physiology well enough in order to help them out. But then it's like the fear of having to go back there again. Like he was, to a certain extent, not only is he agoraphobic, but he's also got this what seems like a pretty good amount of PTSD just about being having spent those difficult years on Mars.
There is one more story which takes this to an even more extreme. In 1960, Conditions of Employment, I'm going to give this a spoiler, but these spacers are traveling between Earth and Mars, Earth and Mars, Earth and Mars.
This is the Mac story.
Yes, Conditions of Employment, 1960. And so to get them to get back on a spaceship to go to the other planet, they manipulate their minds to be nostalgic for the other place. And so they go to Earth, then they're nostalgic for Mars because they have been implanted with having to return back home. And it's the only way to get the astronauts back up into space. And so he take this incredible agoraphobia and the sort of longing of home are constantly sort of cropping up in the arena of space travel. And sort of questioning how humans will actually be able to interact in places away from them, which is why he likes ESP so much, like, and sort of being able to travel and go places and interact without physically leaving.
Yeah, kind of like how Waystation has like the instant transport through the portal and all that. Yeah. Yeah. And because I think Simak he was less interested in like writing about like how a rocket ship worked or whatever, he just didn't care about that. All right. So let's get into talking just a little bit about I do want to cover City as a novel at some point, but one thing that I think is really interesting, if you look at like I have a couple editions of City in my house, and if you look at the Ace paperback edition, which I think this is from the 70s, where he added the epilogue, and this is the version that I first read. The first time I read it, when Matt Whitaker at Karma Records told me to read Simak, and that would have been sometime in the 90s, and I was not sophisticated enough to get what I was reading for the most part. And then I reread a hardcover special edition sometime about a decade ago was the last time I read City. And I recently picked up the Sci-Fi Masterworks edition, because the Sci-Fi Masterworks editions rule. And what's interesting is if you read this back cover, it's all about Jenkins, right? This is a novel about Jenkins. And if you read the back cover description on this one, it's all about civilization. And it's interesting how, because they're both correct, they're both a correct way to write about the book, but they're two different themes for what's going on in this one book. I personally find that City is, it's not perfect. It's definitely dated. It's definitely a piece of its time. But man, this is one of the best science fiction novels ever written. In my opinion, it's up there. I don't know. How do you guys feel about how it ranks in your personal like canon? Because to me, every time, like I've been asked a couple times to write articles or do videos about like what are classic science fiction novels that should become movies. And like it's funny talking about City in this context because most people would have no fucking clue how to do it. But I've thought a lot about how to do it. And if somebody had the fucking kahunas and the money to give it to me, I feel like it could be done. But it's partially because I think this is a masterwork. It is one of the best science fiction novels. And if you are willing to focus on the ideas, there's a lot there. Greg, where does this fit in your personal canon?
It's pretty high up there, and not only because of the subject matter and because of what the kind of interesting way that he was able to string the whole narrative together, which I think was cool. And I mean, who doesn't love a story about intelligent dogs? But it's more his prose style blows me away, because I think I told you I haven't revisited this one in a long time.
Yeah.
And going back to it and appreciating not only the concepts and the plotting for where it really is, but also his use of language is incredible. And I mean, it stands up to some of the better writers contemporary. I mean, and he was writing, in the early 30s and on. And I think that his stylistically and everything, it's very high up there. Not only, like I said, just for the
Without a
story
word
itself.
processor, without the ability to go back and
Yeah, no, I think he's there's some like very poignant just little sentences here and there throughout it. And I know that, not everybody's looking for that kind of stuff, but I kind of try to break down the novel all the way through, and being able to look at it again now, with a much more critical eye than the last time I read it. It's up there, man. It's, I don't know if I put it in my top three, but it's definitely probably in the top five for sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure where in my top 10 it is, but it's probably in the top 10. I'm always going to be a Bruner and a PKD guy, like Le Guin. These are going to be like some of my tops, but and to
I,
me, just for the record, I think the best science fiction novel of the 20th century is Stand on Zanzibar. But yeah,
Canticle for Leibowitz.
Leibowitz is my number two. Leibowitz
Okay,
is my
yeah,
number two.
that's I go back and forth with those. They fall somewhere in that area too.
Yeah, yeah. Joaquin, where do you think this fits in the?
So so the last time I read the full novel was in my late teens, so it's been quite a long time. But so I do find it one of my favorite 50s novels in its novel form. I do think there are near perfect moments. For example, the next, I think it's two stories from now, it's Desertion, which is in also published in 1944. I think that's almost a perfect short story. Um, I tend to engage with science fiction. I, of course, find wonderful things as I'm reading, but I find him most interesting, and I find these stories most interesting through the lens of sort of 40s sort of politics and all of that. And so yes, I rank it very highly. Also, my actual, I won't give too much details, but research, sort of academic research, had to do with memory and how we sort of interact with the past. And so I find this, as it's like a longue durée, thinking back at the past and humanity's sort of place in the past, absolutely fascinating. And I do think that elevates it, which is another reason I like Canticle of Leibowitz. Um, also, also, Simic is really, as I mentioned earlier, he's deceptively complex in his thoughts, and he sort of tricks you with the prose because it's so easy to sort of slip into his stories and the sort of inner thoughts of people and all of that. But he is sort of constructing, as we have mentioned before, a sort of highly original slow apocalypse of humanity. And so I find that profoundly interesting. On like a personal level, I grew up in rural Virginia. Um, my parents were students at Virginia Tech, so I lived off in a holler in rural Appalachia, and I those were the best years of my life. I had access to 1,000+ acres. I wandered around, and so I get Simic on the nostalgia angle as also somebody who now has to live in a city, and so I always find that very, very appealing. And he goes on record for later saying that he's constructed a vision of what life was that does not exist, that he has gone back into his hometown and he couldn't live there either. It's no longer a place for him. But where does sort of Simic find solace? He finds solace in gardening, like in his suburban house outside of Minneapolis, in gardening. And so any sort of rumination on city life and rural life and the sort of love of the land and interacting in a good way with the land and being respectful for your neighbors and a brotherhood of species and all of that really do elevate it as a work of literature.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I do think that there are some thematic connections to Canticle for Leibowitz. That long view of history and those types of things. And uh I have in the past recommended City as to people who are fans of Canticle, and saying like, they're very different. I think City's a lot pulpier, right? It but at the same time, that 20-year difference, almost 20-year difference in perspective, I think, makes a difference. And Walter Miller just and it's a shame we didn't get more writing out of him, but him and Walter Tevis are the two that I just wish wrote more. Why didn't they write more? But yeah, but we did get a lot of Clifford Simak, so there's plenty to cover here, and a lot to discuss. I hope that people who read the story for this episode or who maybe might be new to Simak, let's talk to them about where to go next, because I definitely think, I mean, obviously we've been selling people on City, right? Um, it is not considered one of his best novels, but I am a big fan because it's launched me on him, is Cemetery World, which also kind of has like the whole Dead Earth thing, and has some cool moments with that. But I also think Way Station was his Hugo winner, and I think for the pastoral Midwestern sci-fi thing, I think Way Station is kind of a must read. I don't think it's nearly as good as some of his other novels, or I mean, nearly as, I don't like it as much as nearly some of his other novels, but it is very good, if you know what I mean. Like, it's more good than I liked it. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes your favorite movie in a series might not be the one you think is the best, but the one that you think is the best might be different from your favorite, right? So I think Way Station is very good. Greg, how would you recommend people continue moving forward with this?
More likely his later stuff for me, at least as a reader, and that's where I would, it was Time is the Simplest Thing was the one with the, like basically where there were a lot of people with paranormal abilities and were getting kind of uh shut out of society because of it. And I think that one, just because it has more of it's got time travel and a whole lot of, I don't know if that one was that one up for a Hugo at 1.2. I'm gonna have to look and see because I have a copy somewhere, but it's
Yeah, I'm
not
not
gonna be
sure about that, but
anything.
one I forgot to mention was Ring Around the Sun, which is a very interesting look at capitalism, right? And that's another one that was early for me. It was like the second or third one that I got of his, and yeah.
Yeah.
So
So yeah, I think, like I said, time is the simplest thing. He was getting into the late 50s or the 60s with that one, but I still think it's one that deserves more recognition. I try to find the lesser known books and try to push those to some folks because it's too easy to get some of the more popular ones, and I like to try to be able to at least broaden the spectrum that'll, and I'm also trying to, a lot of times as a bookseller, man, I'm trying to match like three different ideas. Someone's into this and into that and they're sci-fi, but I don't like this. I don't like hard science. I don't like hard space travels. I don't like space opera stuff. So I'm always trying to mix it up. So anyway, I guess that would have been my answer.
mm.
But
Joaquin?
So I will go very esoteric. So he took the original short story, City, 1944, and rewrote it I call it a rewrite in 1955. It's full cycle. It's the same, the threat of nuclear war. That was, of course, in the revised version of City, forces people off into decentralization. And in this world, they join unions, which are actually able to sort of stand up to big industry. And so it's like a terrestrial sort of version of the City story. And it sort of spells out his post-capitalist vision where humans out in the countryside are able to sort of reconnect to skills that they have always had, but technology sort of hid it.
Where is that one
As for
collected?
it's in Worlds Without End, 1964.
Hmm.
Full cycle. Yeah, it was rarely reprinted, and so I did give you my esoteric one. Much more easy to find, and I would argue maybe his best novel. I know that might be a little bit controversial. Maybe his second best novel after City is Why Call Them Back from Heaven, 1967.
I have that sitting on the shelf
Yes.
right here. I have not read it.
So it has been a while since I read it, but the sort of central premise has sort of stayed with me an incredibly long time. And it's the possibility of immortality the possibility of it as a brand new technology that will be discovered in the next few years and how it transforms society. So, of course, society becomes obsessed with saving up all the money necessary for these treatments to eventually become immortal. And it's all about humanity's development on pause because of the possibility of something in the future rather than living the good life now. And so, again, it's sort of resonating with his criticisms of technology. And so those are my two. Full Cycle 1955, which is very much a sort of rewrite of the very beginning of City, and Why Call Them Back from Heaven from 1967.
That is very Dickian too. I think Phil would have enjoyed that concept. But yeah, we know so little because Phil didn't ever get asked for blurbs, so we don't know which novels he generally liked or didn't like, which is really sad. But every once in a while online, I'll mention a book and Tessa will say, "Oh, Phil loved that one," and I'm always like, "Oh, tell us more." She let us know that he was a huge fan of Canticle for Leibowitz, which we didn't know until she said that. So every once in a while, having his fifth wife hanging around is very helpful in that way. Yeah, the Why They Call Them Back from Heaven, you just bumped it up on my reading list, so I'm gonna pull it off that shelf and put it on the TBR. Maybe in 2 years I'll get to it. The TBR is crazy, man. But that one sounds very good. I remember
it has a weak plot. It's, again, ideas. The actual plot is not as interesting as the ideas, and so it's an idea novel. It's definitely an idea novel.
Yeah, I'm good with that. Yeah, I can rock those. All right, so before we go, you guys want to tell us some other things you're reading, things you're into? It doesn't have to be connected. Greg, why don't you start us off? What's going on at the store? What have you been reading lately?
Well, this coming Saturday, Jonathan Mayberry is going to be there for the premiere release of the third book in his Kagan the Dam series.
I know this will not be out by then, but
The Dragon in Winter, but I get to sell it early. I get to sell it 3 days before. So I've got the okay from Macmillan and I'm able to sell it.
But if people want to get signed copies of any Jonathan Mayberry, you're his local store.
Oh yeah, they can go. Yeah, and yours and John Shirley and every other guest that's been at the store. I try to carry a selection. They're all under signed and collectible at artifactrarebooks.com. I personally just had a story come out in Starlight Pulp Review #4, which if you haven't read that magazine, those guys are great. They're doing super cool stuff. I was very excited to have a story picked up there. That's available through the site as well, but that's a hard-boiled story with werewolves in it. So I mean, it's not a science fiction thing for working for the podcast, but that
Hey,
and
we cover horror here too.
what's that?
We cover
Yeah,
horror.
that's true. Yeah. And I'm reading the pre-release of Brian Asman's Werewolf. I'm reading
Good Dog.
Good Dog right now. Yeah. Because he will also be there. He and Casey Griffin and a couple of others are going to be shown. We should probably talk. Maybe you can jump on that one. That one's coming late September. But for all my upcoming events at all the upcoming events at Artifact Books, go to artifactrarebooks.com. And thanks for having me, man.
I can't believe we've been trying to get Brian on the podcast for a long time, but Casey was Christina was just on to talk about Shrouded Horror. So
Okay.
Fantastic collection. So
Yeah. I've got that one. That's, again, you're talking about TBRs, man. I've got all the publishers sending me their pre-release stuff. Plus I've got all, my friends sending me their stuff. I'm just growing and growing. And I hate to say that I don't get to read for pleasure anymore because it's all fun, but I don't ever usually get to choose what I'm going to read. This was a nice thing to be able to go back and revisit something and do it for enjoyment. So I appreciate it.
And so, and I just wanted to put a shout out to our San Diego listeners. A cool way to go to Greg's store: hop on the coaster,
on the train. His store is only a few blocks from the coaster station, so you can get off the coaster. You can just take the coaster up the coast, get off, go to the beach in Encinitas, eat lunch at Plumeria. That's my suggestion.
Good
Buy
stuff.
some books from Greg, get back on the train, go back to San Diego. It's an awesome day. I
Yeah.
have done that a couple times.
Thanks a
And
lot.
I highly recommend it. So the library in Encinitas is also very nice for
Oh,
sitting.
it's fantastic.
Yes,
I do.
I wrote part of unfinished PKD there on a day when I came to buy books from you.
That's
So
awesome.
that's right. It was unfinished PKD I was working on that day. Joaquin, what are you reading right now? What's the doings on Sci-Fi Ruminations? What do you got coming up?
So if you are interested, of course, in more about Simic's anti-capitalist views and his possible political connections in the 50s ideas, I do have an article coming out with Journey Planet, which will be eventually posted on my site as well, and on Simic and organized labor. I'm currently reading, as for a science fiction novel, The Wolves of Memory by George Alec Effinger, which is absolutely spectacular. Once again,
I
underrated
love
in
when
part.
gravity fails. That was
Yeah.
great. So
Underrated in part because it's about a man sent to this planet by a computer where they have a memory disease where your memory slowly decays, and they realize that they're all the cast-offs from society who've been sent to die, and they all watch each other slowly. It's all connected. It sort of foreshadows a lot of Effinger's own major medical issues later in his life. It's absolutely spectacular. I will conclude
has a
with a
Clans of the
little.
Alphane Moon feel to it too.
Yeah, it's really good. It's very, again, interior. It's one of the jobs which he's been the computer has tried to get him to do is become a science fiction writer. So it's also sort of incredibly meta. It's fantastic. I have read a Simic nonfiction, his Worldcon speech where he was given the Grandmaster Award. It's right there in the middle of the clash between the new wave and all of that. And he essentially goes up there and says, all science fiction is good. There's place for all of us. It's all fascinating. And a lot of people don't really see Simic as a new wave author, but the big shift in his writing in the late 60s and 70s, it suddenly becomes fantasy elements. He has all these different, and he tends to believe that fantasy and science fiction are the same genre. And
Yep.
his later stuff sort of shifts radically and becomes strangely comic. And it's his sort of take on the new wave. And so he sees it as a moment to experiment. And so his Worldcon speech is fantastic.
Is that
And
one on video too? But
I have not looked at it. I tend to be a reader. There's a recent volume, it's over there, else I would grab it, on a lot of all the Worldcon Grandmaster speeches and stuff like that. That is how I sort of found it. It's really great.
I just dropped a bunch of bones on C.L. Moore's letters to
Yeah.
Lovecraft, so I don't know if I can justify getting the World Cup, but
But often, when you have these older authors like Asimov, they're very frustrated with the new wave and where science
that's
fiction
right.
is going. And Simic, as one of the old school authors, just takes this utterly different tact, which is so refreshing and appealing. And it gives it, he's proud that so many more people are writing in the late 60s and 70s. And he straight out says that when he got started, the writers were trashy, and fans could just, without any knowledge of writing, could just write some random story and it would be published. And that's how so many people got started. And he sort of acknowledges the sort of privilege of getting started in the 30s, and how there's so much more competition and how the writing has in some ways improved, sort of general by the late 60s and 70s. And so again, really great speech.
I'll have to check that out. I know there was some, it may not have been Simak, but there was some Worldcon speech where like the Toastmasters were Edmund Hamilton and Lee Brackett, and just their setup on the video, I loved listening to it. But I am a bracketeer, as it were. So, but on that note, yeah, fantastic job, guys. This was a great discussion about Simak. You say tomato, I say tomato. I'm not sure how it's actually pronounced, but until I hear him say it, I like on recording. I'm not sure, but regardless, this is a great story. He's a great author. This is my like fourth time podcasting about him, and I hope more people will find him and keep his work alive. Please help us do that. That's really important and part of the messaging of that. On that note, if you made it this far, you're hardcore. So I'm going to go ahead and make an announcement. My column in Amazing Stories this month is going to be the C.L. Moore Project. And this relates to the two Hoosiers here. C.L. Moore, Catherine Lucille Moore, author of many Weird Tales classics, classic science fiction writer of many masterpieces with her husband, Henry Kuttner, and by herself. But she grew up in Indiana, and her first job was at the Fletcher, or one of her most important jobs was working as a typist at the Fletcher Trust building. This building still exists today. It's a Hilton hotel, but they kept the 30s motif in the lobby of the building. And if you go there now, the mail slot is still there. This is the mail slot that when C.L. Moore was writing her stories for Weird Tales, she would mail her stories like Shambleau, the classic vampire story from the 30s, Shambleau, Black God's Kiss, all the Jorel Jory stories. She was staying after work to use the typewriters at work to write these stories and dropping them in that mail slot that still exists in Indianapolis. So my proposal, and I'm getting a bunch of authors to sign on to this, and academics, is we need a plaque on that wall that says C.L. Moore submitted her stories here and says who C.L. Moore was. And we're willing to put on a Catherine Con in Indianapolis to celebrate her work and to memorialize this if we raise the funds, which we will. I just need the Hilton Corporation to say yes to putting this on the wall. It doesn't need to be big. And this will add to the historical trip that you can take to Indianapolis. The Ray Bradbury Center is in Indianapolis. You can visit Ray Bradbury's writing desk. I sat at it in Indianapolis. You can sit in the chair he wrote Martian Chronicles in. It's there in Indianapolis. The Kurt Vonnegut Museum is in Indianapolis. So we need one more place that you have to visit on your nerdy tour of Indianapolis, right? And that's the C.L. Moore plaque. So please, when this article will already be out by the time this episode is out. So you can search it on 25th Century Five and Dime, my column on Amazing Stories and the C.L. Moore Project. And please pass the word on this. If you're an author, an academic, a scholar, a librarian, add your name to the signature sheet. And let's make this a reality. Let's honor the memory of Catherine Lucille Moore, an absolute titan in science fiction. And on that note, I'm going to close out. I'm David Agranoff. As always, my latest two books, People's Park and The Last Night to Kill Nazis. Last Night to Kill Nazis is available everywhere nationwide at Barnes & Nobles, but where you should get it, because you can get it signed by me, is from that man right there, Greg, on Artifact Books website. So, Greg, you have one more thing?
Oh yeah, just artifactrarebooks.com, and there's a signed and collectible store there. And yes, indeed, you may find signed copies of David's fantastic Nazi killing vampire gore fest.
Yes, the Schrodenfried is hardcore there. So, and on that note too, you have other vintage books up on the website too that you have in the store, or
yeah, I don't put a lot of vintage right now, but that's something I'm moving toward, because I might have just purchased another like 100,000 vintage paperbacks between the 40s and 60s.
Woo!
So I actually have a new.
Hey, give a pal a first look at those.
Well, you know what? It
Tell me
turned out
when
to
they're
be
in the store.
about 100 bankers boxes, I think, right now. So
Whoa.
definitely give you a shot. Let me know when.
Wow, that is fucking awesome. Yeah, yeah, you have great stuff there.
Thanks,
So,
man. Thanks.
uh, yeah, Artifact Books, one of my favorites. So, yeah, definitely, great store. So it's
Appreciate
up
it
there
very
in
much.
Encinitas. And Joaquin, I will keep you posted because if we do Catherine Con, you're gonna have to do a presentation at it. You're right there. So
Yeah, I just read Vintage Season for the first time. It's absolutely a spectacular short story, which she wrote with her husband. And
yeah,
her final novel before she stopped her writing career, Doomsday Morning, is absolutely fascinating.
yeah, I like that book, but I didn't like it as much as some of the other things she wrote. Vintage Season, I just reviewed on my blog as well. But the word that I read from my research was is that most people think she wrote most of Vintage Season herself. And that because it was under the name Lawrence O'Donnell, a lot of people gave because that was or well, it was one of their pen names. People gave Kuttner credit, but she wrote most of it. Is the word, and that there are some stories under that name that he wrote most of, and they just they had quite a team, quite a team up. So it's hard to parse that stuff. But yeah, C.L. Moore is great. Yeah, Vintage Season is an incredible novella. Yeah, absolutely agreed. Also astounding. All right. On that note, you can tell these three guys can nerd out about fiction for a long goddamn time. So, on that note, thanks for joining us. And the next episode of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, I'm going to get my Star Trek Bridge crew together. Sarah Lynn Mishner and Issa Dia, who always cover every season of Star Trek with me when the season ends, because we're doing Arena next, the Frederick Brown story, which got adapted into a Star Trek episode ish, maybe retroactively. Well, let's talk about that next time when we do Arena by Frederick Brown, another Midwestern author straight out of Milwaukee. So we're only one state over. And back then it was like the hardcore scene, Greg. Well, you know how like each city has their band that represents their town. Like back then there was a science fiction writer from like every town, like Simak represented Minnesota and Brown and Block represented Milwaukee, but the Winebound too. I'm not forgetting Winebound, but Milwaukee had those three. So, we're back, we're staying in the Midwest. So see you guys next time on the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series with that one, Frederick Brown's Arena. Thanks for joining us.